It seems that these days trust in politicians and public officials is at an all-time low. Hardly a day goes by without some scandal or other coming to light and some corrupt official needing to resign. However, we should probably count our blessings that most of these greedy, nose-in-the-trough bureaucrats and politicians are at least sane, or they at least resemble being sane in public. Anyway, today's video deals with the terrible consequences of what can happen when an entire country is under the personal control of a dictator who is, to all intents and purposes, completely insane. Equatorial Guinea is a tiny nation located on the sub-Saharan coast of Africa. It consists of a tropical mainland area called Rio Muni and an offshore island which was at the time named Fernando Po. Although Equatorial Guinea was the only Spanish colony in sub-Saharan Africa, it wasn't immune from the effects of the push for independence which was sweeping through the African continent by the 1960s. By 1968, time was running out for the incumbent colonial powers, and the outgoing Spanish were looking for someone who they could leave in power to do their bidding once the transition to an independent nation had been completed. Enter Francisco Macias Nguema, a 44-year-old local mayor who had risen through the ranks of the civil service due to his outspoken support for the Spanish regime. He seemed to be the ideal candidate for a would-be puppet president, but there was just one tiny aspect of his personality that the Spanish backers seemingly chose to ignore, and that was that Macias was, not to mince words, completely bonkers. Francisco Macias Nguema was born on January 1st, 1924 in the village of Nfinga. His father was a traditional healer or witch doctor who had reportedly killed Macias's younger brother while still an infant. Childhood trauma didn't end there. Eerily echoing the childhood of Jean Bedel Bokassa, the tyrant of the Central African Republic, Macias witnessed his father being beaten to death by a colonial official. This event was then followed by the suicide of his mother a week later. The orphaned Macias went to a local Catholic school where he would hopefully find a better life than the one he'd left behind. Macias was reportedly a very poor student, failing to grasp even the basics of education and preferring to skip school whenever he got chance. However, his fervent pro-Spanish rhetoric ensured that eventually he was allowed to pass the basic entrance exam to the civil service. Somehow, he then managed, and I'm guessing here with a lot of upwards help from the Spanish, to rapidly climb the political ladder. Indeed, Macias's political rise was nothing short of meteoric. He went from court interpreter to MP to local mayor and on to deputy president of the whole country in under a year. As independence approached, Nguema was on the ballot running against former Prime Minister Bonifacio Edu to become the first democratically elected president. Macias won, and took up the position of President of Equatorial Guinea formally as it became independent on October 12, 1968. Now, looking back, it's hard to believe that this really happened, that this illiterate, erratic man was actually voted in as president. Macias had already shown signs of bizarre behaviour. For example, a few eyebrows must have been raised when, during a speech he gave in Madrid, he launched into a passionate defence of the late Adolf Hitler, claiming Hitler was in fact the, quote, saviour of Africa, and that he himself was a committed Hitlerian Marxist, whatever that means. Macias was also a heavy drug user, regularly eating raw cannabis and consuming large amounts of iboga, a strong hallucinogenic drink that's popular in the region. Now, Macias's strange behaviour hadn't gone unnoticed. The French ambassador to Equatorial Guinea openly stated that he thought Macias was insane, and the French Secret Service had a file on him wherein they speculated that he was infected with venereal disease that was actually rotting his brain. Nonetheless, this was the guy that the Spanish had groomed for presidency, and who actually won the country's first free, democratic election. Is it any wonder that things were about to go rapidly downhill for the people of Equatorial Guinea? Equatorial Guinea had been run by the Spanish as a plantation colony, exporting lumber, coffee and cocoa. Now, it wasn't a tropical paradise by any means, but it was a functioning state with a functioning government. The health service was much better than that found in neighbouring countries, and the population enjoyed one of the longest life expectancies in the region. And Macias was about to change all of that, and not for the better. The trouble began not long after Macias took power. In February 1969, whilst on a visit to the coastal town of Bata, Macias was incensed to find Spanish flags still flying. Taking this as a personal insult, he mobilised the local youth to find and kill any Spanish inhabitants, a task which they seem to have taken up with gusto. In a complete U-turn, fiery anti-Spanish speeches were now broadcast daily on the radio, leading to most of the 7,000 or so Spanish colonists to flee the country, abandoning their houses, plantations and property. These were promptly seized by Macias and given away to family members and lackeys. Now, the Spanish that fled constituted a large part of the country's technical staff, experienced civil servants and wealthy businessmen. The foreign minister, Madongo Mione, alarmed at this rapid exodus of capital and expertise, protested against Macias's sudden anti-Spanish rhetoric. Subsequently, he was summoned to a meeting at the presidential palace, where he was beaten, had both legs broken, and was then thrown out of an upstairs window, before being dragged off to the notorious Black Beach prison, where he was brutally tortured and finally murdered. Other guests to the prison included the former Prime Minister Bonifacio Edu, whom Macias had stood against in the election, and a former foreign ambassador. Both were brutally tortured and killed. It seemed that being high up in the political elite of Equatorial Guinea was no protection from the new president. Macias now sought to consolidate his power. Out of the original 12 government ministers, 10 were executed and replaced by Macias' family members. His nephew, Colonel Teodoro Nguema, became head of the armed forces, head of prisons, de facto ruler of Fernando Po Island, and commander of the National Guard. Another nephew was simultaneously Minister for Trade, Finance, Information, State Affairs and Security. A former football player was promoted to Director of Hospitals, even though he had no medical knowledge whatsoever, and so on and so forth. In the Christmas incident of December 1969, Macias had 186 political opponents rounded up and herded into the National Football Stadium in Malabo. There, under the glaring floodlights and with the Mary Hopkins song "Those Were the Days" blasting out on the stadium address system, Macias had 150 of them shot by executioners dressed up in Santa Claus outfits, while he watched from the stands, laughing and singing along. The remaining 36 prisoners were buried deep in the pitch and left to the mercy of a colony of red ants who consumed them alive over the next few days. Equatorial Guinea descended into a morass of madness and mayhem. With Macias and his immediate family running all aspects of government, they were free to loot and pillage the country as they saw fit. A climate of fear and treachery gripped the country. People were executed on a whim. For example, one government minister who provided a demographic projection that Macias thought was too low was dismembered, in Macias's words, to help him learn how to count. Macias's paranoia began to ratchet up. Former boyfriends of the women he bedded were executed, as well as the husbands of women which he coveted. Anyone hoping to just survive the regime and wait for the day when Macias could be voted out of power were to be sorely disappointed. Although he'd been elected to serve only 5 years as president, he passed decrees and laws granting himself presidency for life, and all government power was transferred directly to him. He would personally be in charge of everything: international trade, the judiciary, the economy, foreign relations. It was all headed by Macias. In a national plebiscite of 1973, which was approved by 99.9% of the voters naturally, he saw the constitution torn up, and absolute lifetime power was formally transferred to Macias. On the international scene, Equatorial Guinea had more or less disappeared off the map. International trade had all but ceased, foreign journalists were banned, and visas for anyone wishing to visit the country were severely restricted. Now you can see the effect of this in the media available for this video. Despite some deep searching, I couldn't find any photographs of Equatorial Guinea and what it looked like during Macias's rule. With Spain keeping tight-lipped about what was going on, the outside world remained largely ignorant of the plight of their former colony. Although Macias did keep open relations with the Soviet Union, Communist China, Cuba and North Korea, who all backed his regime and provided him with various forms of aid. By the mid-1970s, most of the government ministries had run out of funds and their offices had been shut down. The only people to receive any form of payment were Macias's family and members of the militia and military that kept him in power. The central bank was closed in 1976 after its director was publicly executed, and Macias took the entire national cash reserves out of the bank and had it transferred to his village compound in Mongomo. The plantation economy had utterly failed, so he reintroduced slavery to Equatorial Guinea, press-ganging members of various ethnic tribal groups into forced labour to try and keep his abandoned plantations running. Not surprisingly, not many people wanted to be part of this new economy, and tens of thousands fled the country, crossing to neighbouring Cameroon and Gabon. To try and stop this exodus, Macias had the country's only road to the border laid with mines. The land borders were booby-trapped with spiked ditches and watched by soldiers, and he also banned the use of boats. He decided to burn the entire fishing fleet of the country rather than have anyone use it as a means of escape. At the same time that Equatorial Guinea was descending into a failed state, Macias was bestowing upon himself all manner of accolades. He was known as the unique miracle, the great maestro of education, science and culture. Fernando Po Island was renamed Nguema Biogo, and the official motto of Equatorial Guinea was changed to "There is no other god than Macias." And yet, in reality, this was a man who banned the use of lubricants in the Malabo power station, declaring to the workers that with his witch doctor powers, he could run the power station using just magic. Yeah, it blew up shortly afterwards. The long, rambling and often incoherent speeches that Macias broadcast on the radio returned to the same themes over and over again. A hatred of intelligence and intellectualism. A hatred of anything foreign or Western, a hatred of education, and this was reflected in the policies which Macias introduced. Formal education was banned in 1974, Christianity was banned in 75, the churches locked up, and all the missionaries expelled from the country. Western medicine was next banned as it was un-African, resulting in skyrocketing death rate from pandemics of tropical diseases which now ravaged the country afresh. Skilled workers and academics were also targeted for execution in a move that was aptly described as deliberate cultural regression. By the time investigative reporter Robert Killentsberg managed to wrangle a visa and visit Malabo in 1977, he found a ghost town, devoid of any shops and businesses. The electricity was off for much of the time, government ministries were shut down, there were no working public facilities, and what little trade remained was via the barter economy. The entire country appeared to have been transformed into nothing more than a squalid forced labour camp, leading Killentsberg to coin his famous phrase that Equatorial Guinea had become the Dachau of Africa. With the economy completely destroyed, Macias resorted to kidnapping and ransoming the few foreign nationals who were still left in the country to try and bolster his cash reserves. A German woman was ransomed for $57,000, and the body of a dead Russian got him $6,000. Meanwhile, Macias had retreated to his fortified villa in Mongomo village to live with his 3 wives, and he rarely bothered to visit the capital or presidential palace anymore. By now he was displaying many overt signs of madness, shouting to himself because he was going deaf, talking to people who weren't there, often people he'd already had executed, arranging lavish banquets for non-existent guests, and talking at length to the large selection of human skulls he'd collected and discussing state policy with them around the campfire at night. Most of the money that Macias had taken from the central bank was hidden under his bed or buried in suitcases in the bamboo bushes around his villa, where a lot of it was slowly rotting in the ground. What little remained of the country's Western medicine was also held there for Macias's personal use. By 1979, Macias was mentally so far gone that he'd started to forget to pay soldiers, and this was a mistake that was going to cost him dearly. In June of 1979, a group of 11 officers of the National Guard had requested money to pay the salary of the militia. Instead of giving them the money, Macias ordered them to be executed. And one of the men that Macias had killed was a nephew, a brother of Colonel Teodoro, the prison director. Around this time, the inept United Nations and the European Commission had finally gotten around to issuing a public statement condemning the Macias rule. It had only taken them 11 years, and they seemingly waited until the country resembled something from a post-apocalyptic movie. Nonetheless, it looked as if the writing was finally on the wall for Macias and his regime. Never one to let an opportunity pass him by, the ambitious nephew Teodoro decided it was time for a change of leadership, and orchestrated a coup against his uncle, taking power in the capital and broadcasting the news on the radio to whoever happened to be left in the country. Upon hearing of the coup, Macias stuffed his car with suitcases full of money before setting fire to the remainder of the estimated $100 million that he'd been hoarding at his compound. He jumped in the car, fled into the jungles of Rio Muni, but he didn't get far. A few days later he was picked up and returned to Malabo to stand trial on charges of embezzlement, murder, treason and genocide. The trial took place at the Mafril Cinema in Malabo, and despite a rambling statement from Macias in which he attempted to highlight all the benefits he'd bestowed upon Equatorial Guinea, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. Macias was furious, declaring that using his magic powers he would be able to return and haunt whoever shot him, leading to a surreal situation where, although he'd been sentenced to death, no one could be found who was willing to carry out the order. In the end, a group of 6 Moroccan soldiers were hired to carry out the task, and Macias got his just desserts on the 29th of September 1979 in the courtyard of Black Beach Prison, where so many other unfortunate souls had met cruel and terrible deaths. In the decade that Macias ruled over Equatorial Guinea, he and his inner circle had effectively sent the country back to the Stone Age. The economy had been destroyed, there was no health service or functioning government to speak of, media and communication networks were gone, as was the power grid. In their place, Macias had brought sickness and death, stupidity, poverty, torture and murder. From an estimated population of around 220,000, 50 to 80,000 had been killed and another 125,000 had fled. That's between 60 to 90% of the entire population who were either dead or gone. He and his cronies had done all this with the tacit approval of the USSR, China, Cuba and North Korea, whilst the Western nations quietly turned a blind eye to his regime. A regime which had been characterised by the worst excesses of xenophobia, tribal racism, slavery, brutality and murder. It's yet another terrible, shameful chapter in human history. Still, looking on the bright side, with Macias's nephew Teodoro now in charge, things would surely get better, alright? Well, to be fair, things couldn't get much worse. Teodoro, as the new president, was smart enough to realise that his role as overseer of Black Beach Prison and de facto ruler of the country while Macias had been away in his compound chatting to skulls and talking to ghosts was something best kept under wraps. He knew what the international community wanted to hear, and after spouting a few platitudes about human rights and democracy, the Western aid money came rolling in. Before too long, Equatorial Guinea had had visits from King Juan Carlos of Spain, the French Prime Minister, and Pope John Paul II. Of course, the reality was that Teodoro was Macias's enforcer. He was kind of like Himmler to Macias's Hitler, but seemingly with a wave of his hand and a few vague promises to be better, the international community decided that there was nothing to see here and his tenure as president was ensured. The butcher of Black Beach Prison was in power and happy to close the door on anything he may have done during the rule of his uncle. During the early 90s, oil was discovered off the coast of Equatorial Guinea, bringing a deluge of wealth to the country. Thanks to oil revenues, Equatorial Guinea now has the highest per capita income in Africa, exceeding that of South Africa, Egypt, Mauritius and the Seychelles. However, a recent World Bank report stated that around 80% of the population still live in crushing poverty. Many people don't have access to clean drinking water, and infant mortality rates are appalling. Equatorial Guinea is often cited as one of the most corrupt nations on earth, with a human rights record on par with that of North Korea. As for President Teodoro, he's still in power to this day, the longest serving president in history. Completely fair and democratic elections are held regularly, and are regularly won by Teodoro, with an astonishing 98% landslide in almost every election since he took power back in 1979. And that lovely, lovely oil which he sits on ensures that no pesky investigations into his activities during the Macias years will ever become a reality. Indeed, it seems that the opposite is now true. Teodoro himself is welcomed warmly at meetings of world leaders, and there are many photographs of him with various popes, heads of state, high-ranking politicians and celebrities. He's spoken many times at the United Nations, calling for the West to do more to end African poverty. He was lauded as a champion of human rights at a 2004 conference headed by none other than Condoleezza Rice, the then head of US National Security. All of these accolades heaped upon a man who runs one of the most corrupt and inequitable countries on earth, and who was once in charge of a torture and murder centre. Honestly, you couldn't make this stuff up. But Teodoro won't live forever. Luckily for the people of Equatorial Guinea, he's got his son, Teodorin Jr., set to take his place. Currently serving as Vice President of Equatorial Guinea, Teodorin Jr. looks like just the man to finally bring prosperity to the people of the country. A bon vivant, Instagram star, international playboy with a love of supercars, yachts, private jets and all-round luxury living, he seems to be a real man of the people. Yeah, the future certainly looks bright for Equatorial Guinea.